This is the Kofford Books AuthorCast.
I really don't like stories where someone's, stories of faith where people are kind of struggling and then suddenly something happens and everything's fine again. I think faith is a roller coaster where sometimes you're really high up there and you really are believing strongly, and there are other times when that's not the case and you're at a pretty low point. And
Right.
I think that's true for everyone, and I think it's important to validate that and to recognize that.
Today we're talking with Scott Hales, author of The Garden of Enid, Adventures of a Weird Mormon Girl, Part 2. Scott, welcome back to the AuthorCast, and thanks for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you. I'm happy to be back.
Now, before we get started, I just want to give a fair warning to our listeners that there may be some minor spoilers for Part 2 in our interview. I'm not going to give too much away, but there are some important themes that I think that we should touch upon. So if you don't want any spoilers, then stop listening to this interview now and come back after you've read The Garden of Enid Part 2. So for listeners who haven't checked out our interview for Part 1, can you just give us a basic background on Enid, who she is, and how she came to be?
Yeah, so The Garden of Enid, Adventures of a Weird Mormon Girl is a graphic novel that originally started off as a webcomic back in 2013 and ran through much of 2014. It's about she's mostly 15, 16-year-old Mormon girl just struggling with life and struggling with faith. She lives in a home with a single mother who's quite sick, so she relies a great deal on her ward and that sort of thing. She also is very interested in kind of weird Mormon history, so she's often having conversations with Joseph Smith and other Mormon historical figures, and also Mormon kind of cultural figures or mythological figures, things like Bigfoot.
These conversations are mostly like daydream type conversations.
Yeah, that's how some people have interpreted it. I don't think I've ever given a definitive statement on what they are, but I think a lot of people see them as kind of internal conversations happening, inside her head between herself and these figures to kind of work out issues that she's dealing with, or just have fun. I mean, sometimes she's commenting on contemporary issues or that sort of thing, and she uses these figures to kind of work through them.
Now, how did you come up with the concept of this character?
That is a good question. I mainly wanted to do a Mormon webcomic, and I had tried a few ideas out, and a lot of those ideas were similar to comics I've done more recently. And another webcomic I do called Mormon Shorts. I mean, they were these kind of single-panel gag comics, kind of like what you see in Sunstone or the New Era. But I really wasn't that good at it at the time, I thought, and so I kind of just started drawing this 15-year-old Mormon girl and with kind of a weird personality, and she just kind of leaped off the page, and it seemed to work. She kind of stuck, and I just kept coming up with more stories and more comics about her, and the webcomic happened, and the book happened, and so it's not really anything I planned too much. She just kind of came about.
A lot of people have asked, is she based on anybody that you've known personally?
I don't necessarily think so. I've met people like her before. I've worked a lot with youth in the church, and so I think maybe she's a compilation of a lot of people I've met over the years. There's a lot of, some of my personality is in her, but a lot of it is just, I think, I don't think there's one person that I can pinpoint as the inspiration for Enid, although I can see aspects of friends of mine in her personality.
Now, we published Part 1 in November, and by the time that this podcast comes out, Part 2 will be coming out tomorrow. Now, this picks up right at the end of Part 1, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
So give us a run-through on how Enid had changed through Part 1, and then what kind of changes we can expect to see in Part 2.
So at the beginning of Part 1, when we first meet Enid, she is very much a weird Mormon girl. She's pretty immature. She's in many ways a loner. She deliberately cuts herself off from a lot of people for one reason or another. I mean, she does weird things in Sunday school and in Young Women's, and people kind of look at her strange. And she spends a lot of Part 1 just trying to work through her own weirdness. And eventually she seems to have quite a bit of social anxiety in some ways. She has a hard time getting along with people or making friends. She kind of tries to make friends in some situations, like among the young women in her ward, and it doesn't quite work out. She ends up going to EFY at the very end of part 1 and learns a few things about herself, and she makes some choices that help her to begin to see outside of her world, and helps her kind of warm to the idea of friendship and making human connections and that sort of thing. And so part 2 begins at that point where she kind of makes a decision that she wants to be more engaged with the world and with the people around her. And she quickly learns that often comes at a steep price, that relationships aren't easy, and that they often stretch us to our limits and stretch our emotions to our limits. And so part 2 is I think there's a lot more drama involved in part 2, because she's interacting with people and she's kind of trying to figure this idea of human relationships out. She's trying to figure out how to make human connections and connect with people, and it's quite awkward at times, as teenage years tend to be.
Would you describe Enid as being naturally introverted, and she's attempting to kind of come out of that bubble?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So let's talk about one of those relationships with Kyle. He was
okay,
and he was a big part of part 1. She kind of had a crush on him, and he wasn't very responsive, right? Part 2, she tries to pursue this a little bit further, and it gets a little awkward. I mean, how would you describe it? Kind of he's just not that into you, right?
Yeah. So Kyle is he's a character that is introduced pretty early on in the series in part 1, and we learn is kind of Enid's secret crush. It's pretty unrequited affection or love, whatever it might be. But so she kind of pines for him throughout part 1, and it continues on in part 2. He's not very talkative. He's the young man who comes and administers the sacrament to her mother, who is homebound. And so that's kind of the context in which we know him, and he's kind of a moody, brooding teenager, and she's attracted to that. But along the way, there's a scene that I want to break into where she's going to a movie party. Yeah, so they're at a party, and she begins to snuggle up to him and get really cozy, and you can tell that he's really not that into her. And she eventually finds out that he is, in fact, gay. And this is a complete shock to her, although she finds out from her friend Cindy that this is actually a pretty open secret in the ward, something everybody knows, and Enid had just been too kind of consumed in her own thoughts or consumed in her own world to have noticed or to have paid attention. So it kind of reveals the one-sided nature of her relationship, and it kind of wakes her up to realize that there's more to this person than she realized. And at the same time, you've subtly inserted a pretty important social issue that we're dealing with right now, and that's being gay in the church. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, I talk about this, or I go into this a little bit in the notes where I talk about how, when I grew up in the 90s, and this is probably the true for you as well, the idea that there could be such a thing as a gay Mormon, a faithful gay Mormon, an active gay Mormon, was just something, nobody considered, nobody talked about, nobody thought was possible. And that since changed. I mean, it's still obviously contested space, but it's a different situation. I guess what I was trying to do with it is I wanted to show a story or provide a story or a subplot to Enid's story that kind of reflects this changing situation within the church that we really haven't quite worked through. And the book doesn't really quite come to any sort of conclusion other than the fact that here he is and he's a character. Right. And he's an individual, and yeah. Yeah, but at the same time, he's active in the church. He serves her sacrament the next following Sunday, and she feels a little awkward because, their little, her climbing all over him kind of, makes her feel a little awkward. But they maintain their friendship through this. Yeah. Right. So I think it's I think it's positively portrayed. Mm-hmm, sure. Yeah, it's definitely meant to be positively portrayed, and I think it just enriches things. I think it enriches her relationship with him.
Now, probably the biggest theme in the book is a relationship to her mother, and we're not going to get too spoilery on this. But let's say that they end up having a pretty big rift, and Enid ends up moving in with another family. Can you talk a little bit about this, about kind of what led up to this tension between them, and how this rift kind of changes Enid?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. So the rift comes about because Enid and her mother do not have a very good relationship in a sense that they don't really talk to each other and they don't really know much about each other for a number of reasons. I mean, her mother suffers quite severely with depression and other health issues, and Enid has a hard time connecting with her because she doesn't quite have the same. She doesn't suffer from depression or anything like that, and so she has a hard time kind of understanding where her mother's coming from. And since they don't talk, Enid doesn't know a whole lot about her past, and so she begins to pry into her mother's things, into her journals, into her just trying to learn more about her. But she goes about it the wrong way. I mean, she violates her mother's privacy, and that becomes very hurtful to her mother, and that's what initiates the rift, and then becomes a matter of both of them just trying to swallow their pride and come back together. In a positive way.
Well, and the bishop gets involved, and
yeah, exactly. And so the bishop kind of acts as a mediator, and it's painful all around for everyone. I think.
But her mom ends up needing some space from her, right? And asks her to.
Yeah. She sends her out and they kind of have a bit of a reconciliation over Thanksgiving dinner, but her mother's kind of ready to mend things, but Enid refuses to or she tells her that she's not, and so they remain apart because of Enid's choice not to reconcile with her, which I think plays an important part in what happens later.
Right. Now, where does she end up staying?
Oh, she ends up moving in with her friend Cindy, who's kind of her default best friend in the ward. She's another, somewhat weird young woman in the ward, and so they take her in. Cindy's kind of interesting. I mean, she's kind of a goofy character. She's obsessed with everything from the 1980s, and she's just kind of a foil to Enid's weirdness. Cindy is the kind of person that wants to be weird, but deep down is not really that weird. So
that's a really interesting paradigm there between the two. You have one who's inherently weird, who's trying to be somewhat normal in her social life, and then you have the other one who's probably a pretty normal kid who likes the allure of weirdness, right? So.
Exactly. And we've all met people like that. I think.
Definitely. The I want to be different, just like everybody else, kids, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We're talking with Scott Hales, author of The Garden of Enid, Adventures of a Weird Mormon Girl Part 2, and we will be right back after this message. Coming soon from Greg Kofford Books, dime novel Mormons, edited and introduced by Michael Lawson and Artis E. Partial as the next volume in the Mormon Image and Literature series. Dime novels probably did more than any other kind of book to turn lower and middle-class Americans into both book owners and book readers. They were so cheap that almost anyone could afford them, and so exciting that almost everybody wanted to read them. It's hard to tell just how many of these dime novels featured Mormons, but the way Mormons were portrayed in dime novels was remarkably consistent over many decades and multiple genres. This consistency tells us that dime novelists were playing with common stereotypes that nearly all their readers recognized. Indeed, these stereotypes worked their way into much of the more respectable literature of the day and influenced the way American culture has interacted with Mormonism ever since. These tropes were based on three things, perhaps the only three things that Americans knew about Mormons in the final decades of the 19th century: Danites, polygamy, and the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Whatever variation occurs in dime novels comes from mixing these three ingredients into new concoctions. For this volume, 4 full-length dime novels have been chosen to represent different aspects of the Mormon image in dime novels. The often lurid and scandalous portrayals of Mormons in these dime novels had consequences for the relationship between Mormons and the rest of the United States. They represent reality for millions of people. Understanding how these stereotypes were created and first employed can help us understand many things about the way Mormonism has always functioned in American culture. Dime Novel Mormons will be available March 21st, 2017. You can pre-order your copy today at gregkofford.com. We're back with Scott Hales, author of The Garden of Enid, Adventures of a Weird Mormon Girl, Part 2. Now, Scott, in Part 1, Cameos played a pretty important role, and you discussed this also in your opening, that she has these conversations with Joseph Smith, various characters, Eliza Snow. Are there some other cameos that we can look forward to in this book that are either just fun or significant?
Yeah, I mean, this one is a little different because I go beyond the Mormon world, and I mean, she has a conversation pretty early on with Jane Austen. She has a conversation at one point with Charlie Brown. There's, she talks with Bigfoot, which is kind of within a Mormon context because she's talking about the famous Miracle of Forgiveness story with David W. Patton and Bigfoot, and which every missionary knows. But yeah, so those are kind of some of the new ones that come in. So the most significant cameo appearance I think in the book is Eugene Englander, the Mormon scholar, a BYU English professor who passed away in 2000 or 2001. Anyway, he appears to Enid. She's in the middle of a faith crisis, and she's kind of struggling with church and struggling with, I guess a lot of it comes about just some things that she had read on the internet. So she's kind of working through these problems, and Eugene England appears to her either in a dream or a vision, kind of like the Angel Moroni, and kind of takes her on a guided tour of faith and belief. They're in space, and
in a pretty sweet
visit
car,
the past.
Right?
Yeah, in a nice, I think a Chevy Impala.
Yeah.
From the 1960s. So it's an interesting comic.
So let's talk a little bit more about her being in this faith crisis and how she's working through this, because I think that her conversations with Eugene Englander are somewhat of a processing for her, right? So
sure.
Let's get into some of those the advice that he offers Enid.
When Enid was kind of in the middle of her faith crisis, I realized that she needed some way to get out of it. And I thought Eugene England might be a good way to do that. I had been reading his essay, I think it's called Why the Church is as True as the Gospel.
Yeah, right.
Which I think is
a classic, yeah.
Probably his most, would you say, it's a classic. It's probably his most famous essay. And so I felt like that I could probably bring some ideas from that essay into the comic. And so I spent a week kind of reading some of his essays and listening to podcasts about him, because I never had the chance to meet him or unfortunately take any of his classes or anything like that. But so a lot of the advice that he gives her comes right out of his essays, where he talks about church being a struggle that refines us, and how life is full of oppositions, and it's through these oppositions that we learn to kind of grapple with paradoxes and ultimately become refined through this process. And the very last panel in the comic is a direct quote from that essay. He says, "I hope you'll give the church a chance again and again. It needs you, and you need it." If it's not a direct quote, it's at least a paraphrase. But a lot of it, there's a lot of Easter eggs in the comic. If you're familiar with Eugene England's writings, then you'll kind of recognize some of the words and some of the images that come out.
How does this affect Enid? I mean, after this experience?
Well, so she kind of falls into this faith crisis, through the internet. She kind of goes into, she's a kind of a cocky teenager. She thinks that she knows the gospel really well. So she gets onto something like Facebook or something and kind of tries to argue religion with people, which is never really a good idea in my book. But she comes across
Professor Hurlbut, right?
Yeah. So Darth Hurlbut is what he's called. So it's Phalastus Hurlbut, looking like Darth Sidious from Star Wars. And
right.
But yeah, so he's kind of like this internet troll that occasionally when I would post comics to Tumblr, I would get kind of trolled sometimes. When I would post Enid comics, I would get trolled sometimes by anti-Mormon bloggers on Tumblr, and so he's kind of a nod to those guys. But yeah, so she's just kind of working through just kind of that sort of thing.
Well, before we leave that point, though, I thought it was very fitting that her reaction to him was just to find him ridiculous. Right?
Yeah,
and mostly based on his name, right? It's just your name is Hurlbut, like that's just hilarious, right? So,
I mean, it's the greatest name for Mormon mystery.
Right.
So I mean,
right. Well, but I mean,
it's one of the greatest names. There's probably a better one,
but how better to react to internet troll than just to recognize the ridiculousness of what they're trying to do?
Yeah,
right.
I think that's safe to say. But yeah, I mean, she does that. She also another cameo from this series is Dr. Charles Anton from, the great Martin Harris story about when Martin Harris, visits Professor Anton with the characters from the Book of Mormon. And he kind of shows up with this kind of, he's trying to convince her, that Martin Harris, his testimony can't be trusted. And, he kind of makes fun of, he kind of takes this elitist approach to his experience with Martin Harris, and he makes fun of him, and there's some classism there. And anyway, Enid kind of is not too impressed by that, so he shows up. But a lot of it, I think the heart of her faith crisis, or the comic that sums it up, is one called Enid versus Trusting, where she kind of imagines what it would be like. She kind of wishes she could go back to the Sacred Grove in 1820 and kind of spy on Joseph while he's saying his prayer to see if she could, actually experience the vision with him. And so the idea is that, she could know for sure if she were there, she would know for sure, and she wouldn't have to struggle so much. It'd be much easier to live the gospel if she knew for sure that Joseph Smith had seen what he'd seen. And so I think that kind of sums up the heart of her crisis, that she has a hard time at this time just trusting, having faith in God that these things came about, that sort of thing.
Now, I appreciate how you handled this. It's a pretty sensitive topic, and obviously there's a lot of people that were introduced to your webcomic through maybe a Facebook group where there's a lot of different journeys of faith going on and questions about faith and whatnot. So your audience kind of has that built-in segment of people who are going through a similar struggle. But I appreciate how you didn't necessarily wrap it up in a nice, neat little bow and say, boom, fixed, done. It's that constant struggle between trusting and seeking, right? That tension that exists between the two still seems to exist within her, right?
Yeah, and I think that's, and I really don't like stories where someone's, stories of faith where people are kind of struggling and then suddenly something happens and everything's fine again. I think faith is a roller coaster where sometimes you're really high up there and you really are believing strongly, and there are other times when that's not the case and you're at a pretty low point. And
right.
I think that's true for everyone, and I think it's important to validate that and to recognize that.
Right. But at the same time, it seems like her resolve hasn't really shifted much, right? So even if she's got these internal tensions going on, it doesn't seem like there's any point in the book where she's resolved that she needs to separate herself from her religious faith.
Oh, no, not at all.
No. Now, skipping to the end here of the book, she leaves for Cincinnati, isn't it?
Columbus. Yeah, she lives in Cincinnati. I mean, we never say that in the
Gotcha. Okay.
In the book, but that's where she lives.
Oh, okay. So she leaves for Columbus to try to find her father, whom she's never met. And it's not, getting back to the whole, this isn't wrapped up with a nice, neat little bow. That part also doesn't seem to be wrapped up in a nice, neat little bow. She's kind of riding off into the moonlight, as it were, with this anticipation of hoping to find her father, first of all, in this big city without many clues to go on, and and then hopefully some sort of a relationship develops there. Do you have something in mind? Can you lead us down that path? Are you going to continue that?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I'm a lot of people want me to continue the story, and I think it's worth continuing. I'm not sure I'm that interested in her relationship with her father, to be honest. I have drawn some comics since, and I did draw a comic once, probably a few months after I finished this series, and she just talks about how her father doesn't understand her religious beliefs.
Okay.
So I think I've hinted a little bit about what might have happened after this series ended, but I am kind of interested in exploring the relationship between Enid and her. We find out in the end that she has 3 half siblings, and I think it'd be interesting to maybe explore her relationship with her youngest half sibling,
Sure.
Who's a 10-year-old in this book. In part 2, we learn that she has a 10-year-old sister. I think that might be interesting, but it also might be interesting, I think, maybe to explore. I mean, we find out at one point, or there are clues in part 2 that suggest that her grandparents, her mother's parents, are still alive. I think it might be interesting to explore that relationship as well.
Sure.
I think it would be kind of neat to maybe do a comic on that.
And you've hinted that you may even take it up to her first year of college.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tough thing because the comic has always been in real time. Where, I mean, the idea is that when I post a comic, it's meant to have occurred on the day that I post it. And so Enid has been growing up and getting old, and so she's about 18 right now.
Gotcha.
And so I think this would be the year she'd graduate from high school, so she'd be heading to college in the fall. And I think it'd be fun to kind of see what would happen in college as well, because that's just a new level of awkward.
Yeah,
especially if she goes to BYU, which is
right, opens up all sorts
of Mormon awkwardness. Yeah,
open up all sorts of possibilities for awkward encounters. Now, so because it's in real time, in a way, this to me comes across as her journaling, right? So
I think that's.
So there's going to be a gap, regardless of how we look at it. If you want to stick with the real time model, then the next story isn't going to pick up exactly where part 2 ends off. There will be some sort of a retrospective, I would assume, right?
Yeah, sure.
Interesting.
Maybe.
We'll see. Wait and see.
Depends.
Well, so just one final question. Now, we've talked about Enid's changes as a character, but how has writing Enid changed you?
Ooh, nobody has ever asked me that question. That is a really good question. Well, it's. I think one of the biggest things is that, and I think I've talked about this in other forums, but I'm very different. My very different from hers. I'm much more reserved. I'm not nearly as bold as she is. I mean, I think she is far more courageous than I could ever hope to be or want to be. But I think drawing her character and telling her story has made me bolder in some ways. And what I'm willing to put out, what I'm willing to say, I guess, publicly about my own opinions about, the church, or my own opinions about the gospel and just people in general. I think she's made me a more charitable person in her openness to just a kind of a diversity of ideas and experiences, especially later in the comics. So I think that's true. She makes me want to be more courageous, more charitable. What else? I don't know. I'm not sure if I have a good answer for that.
No, I think that was a perfectly fine answer.
No one has ever asked me that. Yeah.
In a way, I mean, I think that sometimes when if we write fiction, a lot of times the protagonist of the story, hopefully the protagonist and not the antagonist, is somewhat of an alter ego for us, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm almost like the ventriloquist dummy that says what his ventriloquist is saying, his thinking, and
Yeah.
So she kind of gives you an outlet in a way to.
Yeah, and it is kind of interesting that I feel much more at ease saying something bold or controversial online if I can just say it through Enid. Maybe she's a bit of a mask for me in that sense. I don't know. I don't want to
psychoanalyze
myself too much, but
go down a rabbit hole there, Scott.
but yeah, exactly. But I think there is something to that. I do find that saying something through Enid tends to be a lot more. There tends to be something cathartic about that.
We've been speaking with Scott Hales, author of The Garden of Enid, Adventures of a Weird Mormon Girl, Part 2. This is available February 14th from Greg Kofford Books. And Scott, I just want to thank you for being on the show again. It's always great to have you on.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Thank you for listening to the Kofford Books AuthorCast. You can subscribe to our show through iTunes, Google Play, or any other podcast feed of your choice. Ratings and comments are always appreciated. You can preview The Garden of Enid Part 2 or our next title, Dime Novel Mormons, on our website at gregkofford.com. Also, if you are near the Provo area, mark your calendars for Tuesday, February 20th.